They say necessity is the mother of invention, and nowhere is that more true than in the kitchens of the Great Depression. Back when money was scarce, store shelves were bare, and families had to stretch every scrap, a different kind of culinary creativity was born. From vinegar pies that tasted like apples to peanut butter soups that warmed the soul, these weren't just meals, they were survival stories served on a plate. Today, we're taking a bite out of history as we uncover 25 Depression-era foods that most folks have forgotten, but many of our grandparents grew up on. Some are strange. Some are surprisingly delicious. And a few might just make you pause and wonder, how did we ever eat that? But each dish has a story to tell, from back porches in the Dust Bowl to crowded tenement apartments in big cities. These recipes were more than food. They were hope, resilience, and a reminder that even in the hardest times, a little bit of flavor could go a long way. So grab a spoon, settle in, and let's rediscover the forgotten meals that once fed a struggling nation. Egg and bread mash, the breakfast that built resilience. Before cereal came in boxes and breakfast sandwiches wrapped in foil, there was egg and bread mash, a humble morning dish born from the leanest times. You wouldn't find it on a restaurant menu, but back in the 1930s, it was a saving grace for countless American families trying to stretch a dozen eggs and a loaf of bread across an entire week. Picture it, a mother standing at a wood-fired stove, cracking a single egg into a pan. She'd tear yesterday's stale bread into rough chunks, no waste, not even the crusts. Once the egg hit the skillet, those bread pieces were added in, soaking up every bit of yolk and fat like a sponge. Sometimes, a pat of lard or bacon grease added extra richness if you were lucky. It wasn't pretty, but it was warm, filling, and dependable. It carried kids off to school and sent fathers out to long days in the fields or factories with something in their stomachs. And if there were leftovers, they'd be pressed into a tin for lunch. No fancy ingredients. No spices. Just egg, bread, and grit. In today's world of avocado toast and brunch cafes, egg and bread mash might seem like a forgotten relic. But for those who lived through the Great Depression, it represented something more powerful than flavor. It represented survival. Some families added a dash of salt or a spoonful of evaporated milk if they had it. Others topped it with whatever scraps of meat they could find, slivers of onion, bits of ham, or even a spoonful of gravy left from Sunday dinner. But the base stayed the same, egg and bread, mashed together, feeding a family with dignity. Simple, resilient, and unforgettable. Cornmeal mush with honey, the gold of the Depression table. In the darkest days of the Great Depression, when flour was precious and sugar a luxury, cornmeal became the backbone of survival. And from it came one of the most enduring staples of poor man's cuisine, cornmeal mush, a dish as plain as its name, but rich with meaning. It began with water, salt, and coarse yellow cornmeal, slowly stirred over low heat until it thickened into a soft, porridge-like consistency. There was nothing fancy about it. No milk. No butter. Just heat, time, and patience. Some families cooked it until it was creamy and smooth, others let it set and sliced it like bread the next morning to fry it in lard. But when times allowed, when a neighbor shared or a good trade was made, just a drizzle of honey could transform that humble mush into something magical. For children who had known nothing but bitterness and blandness, that touch of sweetness on their lips felt like gold. And for parents, watching their kids smile over such a simple treat brought a moment of joy in a time full of worry. Cornmeal mush with honey was eaten at every hour, breakfast, lunch, or supper. It stuck to the ribs and warmed the bones. And though it lacked the richness of modern dishes, it offered something more: dignity, simplicity, and the rare luxury of comfort. Today, it's all but vanished from our tables. The younger generations wouldn't recognize it, and most grocery store shelves carry instant oats instead. But for those who lived through those lean years, the memory of hot mush and warm honey still lingers like the scent of something precious lost to time. In every bite, there was history, a story of how a single bag of cornmeal could feed a family, fill a heart, and sweeten the harshest days. Tomato and mayo on white bread, the sandwich of southern summers and hard times. There was a time when nothing tasted more like summer or survival than a ripe tomato, a swipe of mayonnaise, and 2 slices of plain white bread. Born from southern gardens and sharpened by the hunger of the Great Depression, the tomato and mayo sandwich wasn't just a snack, it was a strategy. When meat was scarce, cheese too costly, and leftovers long gone, all it took was 1 backyard tomato and a loaf of government-issued white bread to feed a family lunch. The tomato was sliced thick, sometimes still warm from the sun, its juices already threatening to soak the soft bread. A thin layer of mayonnaise added just enough creaminess to balance the acidity. That was it. No lettuce. No seasoning. Just freshness and frugality, pressed together in a simple sandwich. It was cheap. It was fast. And somehow, it was perfect. In the South, this sandwich became more than a Depression-era fix, it was a tradition. It showed up at church gatherings, in work lunch pails, and on back porches, eaten with bare hands and smiles. Children learned early that if you had a tomato, you had a meal. Some would add salt and pepper. A few dared to toast the bread. But for most, it stayed pure. It had to, there was rarely room to change what already worked. Decades later, people still chase the first bite of nostalgia. The softness of the bread, the tang of the mayo, the burst of tomato, it was more than a sandwich. It was a memory of how something so simple could taste so complete. In an age when we complicate everything, maybe this forgotten classic has something to teach us, that sometimes, all you need is the right fruit, a little spread, and 2 pieces of hope to get you through. Fried bologna and mustard sandwich, the poor man's steak of a vanishing era. Back in the hardest years of the 20th century, meat was a luxury, one that many families simply couldn't afford. But there was one thing that almost every grocer kept behind the counter, cheap and filling, bologna. And when you tossed it in a hot skillet and let the edges curl just right, you had something that felt like a feast, the fried bologna sandwich. They called it the poor man's steak. And for good reason. A single slice of bologna, slapped onto a cast iron pan, would sizzle and pop as the fat rendered out, forming golden brown edges and a savory aroma that filled the whole house. Slather 2 slices of soft white bread with yellow mustard, lay down that crispy circle of meat, and maybe, if the day was lucky, add another slice on top. No lettuce. No tomato. No fancy cheeses. Just heat, bread, and a little meat that went a long way. For children growing up in the 1930s and 40s, this sandwich became the taste of childhood. It showed up in school lunchboxes, wrapped in wax paper for factory meals, and on dinner plates when there was nothing else in the icebox. And despite how simple it was, no one complained. Because it was warm, filling, and oddly delicious. The mustard gave it a bite. The bologna gave it heart. Together, they created something that felt more indulgent than it ever had a right to. Today, you rarely see this sandwich outside of a few nostalgic diners or backwoods family kitchens. But for those who remember, one bite brings back a flood of memories, times when love and ingenuity did more than stretch a dollar. They fed souls. This was survival dressed as comfort. And to many, it still is. Depression-era peanut butter soup, a warm spoonful of ingenuity. In the kitchens of the 1930s, when money was tight and ingredients even tighter, the best recipes were the ones that stretched a single item into an entire meal. And few things stretched farther than peanut butter. Enter one of the most forgotten yet strangely beloved dishes of the Great Depression, peanut butter soup. Yes, you heard that right. It wasn't creamy. It wasn't rich. It was a simple, strange blend of boiling water, a spoonful of peanut butter, and whatever scraps could be added for body, stale bread cubes, leftover rice, or bits of onion. Some families added a splash of evaporated milk if they had it. Others left it bare, letting the peanut butter dissolve into a warm, nutty broth. The result? A thin, salty sweet soup that filled the belly and fooled the mind into thinking it was something more. Peanut butter was cheap, didn't spoil easily, and packed protein, making it a Depression-era miracle ingredient. When paired with boiling water and a little imagination, it became a soup that warmed cold hands and fed hungry mouths, especially on long winter nights. For children, it was often the closest thing to comfort food. The nutty smell, the soft bread floating in the broth, it felt like kindness in a bowl, even if the flavor was unfamiliar. Today, it might raise eyebrows. Most have never heard of it. But for those who lived it, peanut butter soup was proof that you didn't need much to make something meaningful. Just a jar, a pot, and a little determination. In a time when meals were made from whatever was left, this dish taught families how to survive with dignity, and how to find warmth in the strangest of places. It wasn't just soup. It was resourcefulness, spooned one bite at a time. Vinegar pie, the desperation dessert that fooled the tongue. In the throes of the Great Depression, when fruit was scarce and sugar even scarcer, American homemakers turned to creativity and a little chemistry to bring dessert to the table. One of the most peculiar, yet beloved inventions to emerge from that era was vinegar pie. At first glance, the name alone turns heads. Vinegar? In a pie? But to Depression-era families, vinegar wasn't a mistake, it was the secret weapon. Fruit pies had long been a staple of American kitchens, but when apples and lemons became too expensive to keep on hand, clever cooks reached for vinegar. Just a tablespoon or two of the tangy liquid, mixed into a custard base of eggs, flour, and whatever sugar they could spare, mimicked the tart brightness of lemon. Poured into a plain flour and lard crust and baked until set, it came out golden, soft, and sweet, with just a whisper of sharpness that made every bite sing. It was often served without topping, sometimes dusted with a bit of cinnamon if available. And for many families, it became their go-to pie, especially in the winter months when fresh produce was simply out of reach. Children who didn't know any better believed it was lemon pie. Mothers let them believe it. And maybe that was part of the magic, the way vinegar, a symbol of sour times, could become something comforting and delicious. Today, vinegar pie is a rare find, often tucked away in regional cookbooks or made as a novelty. But back then, it was a triumph of thrift and taste, a dessert pulled from an empty pantry and a hopeful heart. Because even in the hardest seasons, people still craved sweetness. And vinegar pie reminded everyone that with enough resourcefulness, even the bitterest ingredients could create something worth sharing. Corn Dodgers, the handheld staple that traveled farther than bread. Before energy bars, before fast food, and long before store-bought loaves, there were Corn Dodgers, gritty, golden nuggets of survival carried in the pockets of pioneers, cowboys, and Depression-era workers alike. Simple, sturdy, and surprisingly satisfying, Corn Dodgers were made from just a few humble ingredients: cornmeal, hot water, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a bit of lard or bacon grease. Rolled by hand into oval patties or rough balls, they were baked or pan-fried until crisp on the outside and warm and dense on the inside. They weren't fancy. They weren't sweet. But they were dependable, easy to carry, hard to spoil, and enough to keep you going through a long day of labor or travel. That made them a Depression kitchen favorite, especially for field workers, farmhands, and families without access to ovens or fresh bread. Some folks added a dash of molasses or threw in chopped onions if they had them. Others kept them plain, meant for dipping into beans, stews, or sopping up the last bits of gravy from a plate. They were often cooked in cast iron and cooled on windowsills, wrapped in cloth for tomorrow's meals. Children would tuck them into lunch pails. Fathers would take them out to the fields. They were the working man's ration, and they got the job done. Today, Corn Dodgers are mostly remembered through folklore and dusty cookbooks, but in the 1930s, they were a staple of resilience. Tough, unassuming, and ready for the road. And like so many Depression-era foods, they weren't just about taste, they were about survival. About filling stomachs when choices were few and wasting nothing. In every bite was a story of hard hands, long roads, and the quiet ingenuity of those who made do with what little they had. Cream chipped beef on toast, SOS from the Great Depression to the front lines. Few Depression-era dishes carry a nickname as memorable or as military as this one, cream chipped beef on toast, better known to soldiers as SOS. The initials? Let's just say they stood for stuff on a shingle, though the real phrase wasn't quite as polite. Born in mess halls and adopted in homes across America, this dish was a creamy, salty, stick-to-your-ribs kind of meal that became a staple during the Great Depression and later, World War II. It began with dried beef thin, salty strips packed in jars or cans. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and easy to rehydrate. The meat was chopped and tossed into a bubbling roux of flour, milk, and fat, usually butter or bacon grease, if you had it. The creamy gravy thickened fast, blanketing the beef in rich, savory goodness. Then came the shingle, plain, toasted white bread. A slice or two was laid flat, and the steaming chipped beef gravy was poured generously over the top. That was dinner. Or breakfast. Or both. To many families, it was comfort food. To soldiers, it was predictable fuel. And for Depression-era households, it was a lifesaver high in protein, warm, and inexpensive to make. Sure, it was salty. Sure, it was plain. But it was filling. And it felt like a real meal. Kids who grew up on SOS remember the smell of the bubbling white sauce and the satisfying splash as it hit the toast. Some loved it. Some never wanted to see it again. But all of them remembered it. Today, cream-chipped beef on toast has nearly disappeared from everyday kitchens, but it still lives on in old diner menus and military cookbooks, a symbol of how America ate through war, poverty, and hard times. Because sometimes, the simplest meals were the ones that carried us the farthest. Lard fried apples, the forgotten sweet of the wood stove era. Before sugar was a staple and dessert meant store-bought pie, families turned to whatever they had, and often, what they had were apples. And in the leanest of times, one simple, resourceful dish warmed countless homes: lard fried apples. It sounds rustic. It was. But back in the 1930s, this was considered a true treat. Peel and slice a few apples. Tart varieties like Jonathan or Winesap were preferred when they could be found. Then melt a generous spoonful of lard in a cast iron skillet. Not butter. Not oil. Lard. It was what most homes kept on hand, stored in a tin can near the stove. As the apples hit the pan, they'd sizzle and soften, their juices mixing with the fat. Slowly, they'd caramelize, not from added sugar, but from their own natural sweetness and the deep heat of the skillet. A pinch of salt, maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon if you were lucky. But often, it was just apples and lard. They were served hot, spooned over biscuits, alongside fried potatoes, or even on their own as a stand-in for dessert. Warm, rich, slightly savory, and comforting in a way only hardship-born food can be. For many children of the Depression, this dish became an autumn memory: the smell of apples sizzling in a hot kitchen, steam fogging the windows, and the rare sweetness of something homemade after a long day of doing without. Today, most people recoil at the idea of using lard. But back then, it wasn't just flavor, it was survival. And lard fried apples were a way to take what little you had and turn it into something almost magical. Because in those days, dessert didn't come in a box. It came from the skillet, one spoonful at a time. Cold butter grits, when simplicity was the only option. In today's kitchens, grits are often served steaming hot with cheddar, shrimp, or herbs. But during the Great Depression, grits were something else entirely: basic, bare-boned, and, more often than not, cold. Cold butter grits weren't a delicacy. They were what you ate when reheating wasn't an option. When stoves were cold, fuel was scarce, and every crumb mattered. Made the night before with stone-ground cornmeal, water, and salt, the grits would be cooked over a low fire until they thickened, then poured into a pan or dish and left to cool. Come morning, they were sliced like a loaf and served cold, often with a thin slice of butter melting slowly over the top. For many families, there was no ceremony to it. Cold grits were breakfast, lunch, or even a supper side. No milk. No sugar. No frying. Just grit, butter, and the will to carry on. Some kids would smear molasses or jam on top if they were lucky. Others ate them plain, with nothing but a tin fork and a quiet determination. The texture was dense. The flavor? Subtle. But it filled the stomach. And in a time when hunger was a daily visitor, that was enough. Cold butter grits weren't exciting, but they were dependable. They stayed good without refrigeration. They could stretch for days. And they reminded families that even the most humble meal could carry them through. Today, this dish is nearly forgotten. Few modern cooks would think to slice cold grits straight from the pan and call it a meal. But for those who lived it, cold butter grits are a memory of mornings spent by the window, watching the world struggle to recover, one bite at a time. Because during the Great Depression, food didn't have to be fancy. It just had to be there. These weren't just meals, they were memories. Proof that even in the hardest times, a little creativity and a lot of heart could bring warmth to the table. If you enjoyed this journey through forgotten flavors, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around, there's plenty more history still simmering on the stove.